بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salama ala khayr al-mursaleen. Muhammad al-Nabi al-Ummi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. It's really an honor to be with all of you today here in New Jersey, in the community of Sheikh Qatanani, in the community of Sheikh Yasser Fahmi, in the community of Dr. Ahmad Hamda, in the community of Dr. Raymond Brock. It's such a blessed community. You have so many amazing resources. And I'm excited, subhanAllah, when I came to this convention, one of the things that I was more excited to do than to speak was actually to listen to the people that you have, the amazing resources that you have. So like I said, it's really an honor to be here. The theme that I'm supposed to really address very quickly, and subhanAllah, it's kind of the theme for the entire conference, if you really reflect on it, is this idea of clearing the fog. And I don't know if anyone here has ever driven in really, really thick fog. Raise your hand if you've ever had to drive in the fog. Yeah, it's really hard. When it's so thick that you can barely see the road in front of you, and you end up driving really slowly because you don't want to hit anything, you don't want to crash your car, and it's important. Sometimes when the fog is so thick, just to park on the side of the road, and this happened to us in San Diego, and just wait till the fog is cleared before you drive. And something that's interesting about this theme, clearing the fog, is I don't actually want us to focus on the fog. I want us to focus on the clarity or the clearing of it. Okay, I want the image in our mind to be, how do we get rid of this fog? How do we open our eyes and see things for what they really are? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He says in Surah Al-Furqan, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنْ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهُهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you not seen the one who has taken as their Lord their own desires? And what's interesting about the word hawa is usually people are associated with just the really low desires in terms of falling into zina or addictions of different sorts. But hawa is your whims. It's your actual desires. So it's really anything that becomes your motivator in behavior instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's whatever would make you distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's when you're going to do something, any kind of behavior you're going to exhibit, whatever your intention is, whatever motivates that behavior, it can be your hawa. Okay? And that's something that's important, because people will read the word hawa and they say, okay, alhamdulillah, I'm not interested in committing these lowly acts. It's much deeper than that. It's much deeper than that. And so something I want us to think about in terms of the 12 steps, you know how there's 12-step programs? This is something to think about in terms of qualities that are inner qualities that help clear the fog. Because the opposites of these are fog. And these are the qualities that, as was mentioned earlier, you can't let go of a chain, right? You need to, if you're holding on to something wrong, don't just let go of it because you could just fall into nothing. You need to hold on to the right rope, right? You need to hold on to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so looking at the very first one, I'm going to number them because to go into them in detail, we don't have enough time in the short time we have here. But I want to just mention it, that when it comes to following our desires, one of the ways that, again, we can clear this fog out of our lives is to develop the quality of rida, and to accept the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that would be to develop the quality of contentment, to be satisfied, to accept reality. You know, in Buddhist philosophy, they just call this universal acceptance. In Islam, we call it rida, to just be content and accepting of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed. And the opposite of that is to disapprove of qadr. And we sort of mentioned this in an earlier session. It's to actually subconsciously be blaming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for something that happened to us in the past, or for something that is happening to us right now. So there's a difference, again, between disagreeing with something wrong and disapproving of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself and his qadr. And again, to clear the fog, we have to move into acceptance. We have to close our eyes and say, oh Allah, I accept what you have decreed. قدر الله ما شاء فعل. I accept it. Help me to respond to the situation in the way that you're the most pleased with. When you embrace reality, that's very different than fleeing from it or disapproving of it. It actually moves you into empowerment. And again, it clears the fog. The second one is to have a focus on, the things that you're grateful for. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talks about guidance in the Quran, He usually associates it with those who are grateful. When He talks about disbelief, He associates it with those who deny the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So thinking about it in terms of every day, am I in a negative state of mind? Am I complaining always in my mind about all of my difficulties? Or am I someone who can magnify the good? I can look at something good and magnify it. And subhanAllah, sometimes when people are trying to be humble and Allah allows them to do something good, they try to minimize it so that they can feel, again, like they're not so important or not so good or what have you. So a sister, for example, may be an organizer for a conference like this, and afterwards I might tell her, wow, you did such an amazing job, may Allah reward you. And then she'll say, I did nothing, I did absolutely nothing. And I'm like, no, don't say I did nothing. Because part of gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is acknowledging and magnifying your blessings. So recognize that this is a big thing, but say alhamdulillah, say the good of this is from Allah. It didn't come from me, it was a blessing, it was from the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So magnifying the good always in our lives. Now if we magnify the good and associate to ourselves, that becomes a form of arrogance. But if we magnify the good and always return the credit back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that makes us feel so humbled and so grateful and always thankful really for the blessings that we have. The opposite of that, as we mentioned before, is to really only see the bad. I'm not saying not to recognize difficulties or challenges, but I'm saying where you shift, what your heart is focused on is what will fuel your inner state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, gratitude is a pillar of showing our appreciation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The third one is actually something interesting, especially in our day and age. It's to have time for khalwa. To have time where you really get away from everything and have alone time with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was something Dr. Samira mentioned. She said, today, how many times does a person actually stop everything they're doing and just make sincere, heartfelt dua to Allah? Now in khalwa, it doesn't mean that you just have to make dua. There's a lot of things that a person can do in khalwa. But in this society, we're always encouraged to be out. Be out. And even if you're inside by yourself, you can't be by yourself. You need to be on your cell phone. You need to be on Facebook, on Twitter, on the other Instagram, whatnot. You need to never feel alone by yourself with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what this society is telling us. But in order to clear the fog, our heart has to be focused on Allah, not so attached to the material world, and we need alone time to do that. So if you're a busy mom, sometimes the only time you have is at the very end of the evening, after all the kids are asleep. Even spend 5 minutes of alone time with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is quality time. It's going to have an impact on clearing the fog and helping you have perspective with the different challenges you face. The fourth one is muhasaba, to take account of oneself. And also, again, in this society, we usually try to be in denial of things. We are like being wrong or having shortcomings is seen as such something that you would flee from. Even our nafs wants us to flee from taking account of ourselves. But muhasabah is so powerful if it's done the right way, because as you examine yourself, don't just examine the things you did wrong. Don't just look at the chains. Also look at the things you did right. And when a person has that balanced approach, they know where they stand. They know where they are. And of course, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really, really knows where we are. But at least you're aware of it. At least you're aware of, let's say, for example, if you're doing muhasabah, every evening before you go to sleep, you think about, for example, the sins of the tongue. And you say, you know what, every day this week, I backbited. I have a backbiting problem. That's something that you can only recognize about yourself if you're taking account. Number 5 is to have a person or people that you can be spiritually honest with that can hold you accountable. So not only do you hold yourself accountable with personal accounting, but also you need either a murabbi, a spiritual advisor, a mentor, Or if you don't have access to one, and in this community you have access to many, by the way, if you don't have a murabbi you have access to that you can go to or you feel comfortable going to, then to have a sincere friend who has two qualities. One, they love you unconditionally. They really care about your well-being. So they're not a frenemy. They have to be someone who really sincerely loves you for the sake of Allah and really cares about you. And the other quality is that they push you to be better. They're someone that when you see them, their example, the way they live, pushes you or encourages you to be better. It reminds you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is someone that you would tell that this is something I'm working on. For example, you might tell someone, I'm really trying to not watch television at all. Let's say this is the habit you're trying to get rid of. And you tell this to either your murabbi or your friend. But just by saying it to someone gives you so much motivation to be able to work on that quality. Because so long as you're only working on it with yourself, sometimes you feel like you don't have enough support. But your friend or your murabbi will encourage you. They'll give you words of support when you need it. If you slip, they'll remind you to have hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's really important to have someone like this in your life that you can turn to with the specific spiritual goals that you have. Number 6 is to have himma aliyah, or to have very high ambitions, not necessarily from a material perspective, but from in the way that you want to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, and this is important. The difference is two people can be doing the exact same thing. Two people are trying to get a PhD. One person is trying to get their PhD because this makes them appear successful in society, this pleases their parents, this wins them social acceptance. Another person is getting their PhD because this is their way of serving the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what they want to do as an act of worship for Him. This is something they want to show Him on the Day of Judgment and say, oh Allah, I did this for you. So himma aliyah is to choose lofty goals in the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And never think something is too big when your goal is Allah. If your goal is this life, it's always going to be too big, too hard, too difficult. But if your goal is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even the difficulties on that path, you're going to cherish and you're going to love, and they're going to be very dear to you because that struggle was for Him and not for your nafs. The 7th is at-tawadu', humility. So obviously arrogance would be fog, and humility is the clarity of that fog. A good way to sort of conceptualize humility is not just walking around sort of full of shame. That's not humility. Actually, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he would walk, he was someone that he walked so fast, they said that it was as if the earth was a carpet, it would roll up under his feet. So he had a mission. But humility is really to be someone who, as Imam Hassan al-Banna said, he said, expect less than what you deserve and you will get what you deserve. Expect less than what you deserve and you will get what you deserve. So it's to fight the tendency of the shaitan to put in this waswasa of entitlement. And entitlement is not achievement, okay? Entitlement is feeling like people owe you something. People, you deserve something from the people. You have to get rid of this. And subhanAllah, whenever you look at tazkiyah in Islam, one of the biggest sort of pillars of it is to have something, as I mentioned earlier, it's when you have something, but you're controlled with regards to it. So a person can be very wealthy, and they spend on themselves and their family, but they're not extravagant. Or a person can have all the food in the world, but they deliberately don't eat everything because they have a sense of personal discipline. So humility, a person can have all of the accolades, whatever it is, the worldly successes on their resume, but when they deal with the people, they realize they were created from dust, just like everyone else, and that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows where they stand. So humility, subhanAllah, Imam Shafi'i would say he would never enter a room without feeling like everyone else in that room was better than him. This is Imam Shafi'i. None of us here are Imam Shafi'i, so imagine what that means for us. I can't emphasize this enough because we live in a culture of entitlement. We really live in a culture of entitlement. And I don't know if we have time for Q&A, but this is a very long discussion when it comes to scholarship, when it comes to the way that we treat teachers and the way that we treat activists. Number 8 is, subhanAllah, this is something that is so important. And I have seen with my own eyes people be elevated in this life because of this simple quality. And there's a narration of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that really emphasizes how this simple quality is so big in terms of our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's to have a heart that has only goodwill for people. A heart that only has goodwill and it's full of mercy. So think of rahmah, and think of rahmah as expressed through dua. Okay, so think about yourself and think about the people that you could be upset with and you have grudges with, or they did something to you that was wrong. Maybe it's in-laws, maybe it's people at work, and to just be able to clear that from your heart, whether they're wrong or they're right, and to have nothing but mercy for them. And this is really hard to reach, especially if you've been heavily wronged by someone. But it's a way of actually, drawing closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we have mercy for people not necessarily because they deserve it. We have mercy for them because Allah loves for us to show compassion and mercy, and it is an invitation for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have that mercy upon us too. The opposite of that is someone who has hiqd, someone who just has like this hatred or this anger that they will just never let go. And this enmity is actually a sign of ignorance. It's part of the fog. Again, to clear the fog, think of someone that you wish could forgive you, that hasn't forgiven you, and you should just make dua for them. Think about someone that you find hard to forgive, and just sit and make dua for them until Allah gets rid of the malice in your heart. Number 9, khidmah, to be in the service of others. And the opposite of this is to be selfish and be only in the service of yourself. So to be in the service of others is actually, it's kind of an illusion, because you think that you're serving others, or you're helping others, but truly when you help others, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who's helping you. We know this is one of the 40 hadith from Imam Nawawi, that Allah is in the aid of his servant so long as the servant is in the aid of his brother. And Imam Nawawi actually talks about when the word brother is used in certain ahadith, and he says it's not just your brother in Islam, it's your brother in humanity. So be someone who is in the khidmah of others, and particularly for tazkiyah, it's recommended to choose something that you struggle with. So let's say there's a way that you are, let's say, not balanced in your personal life, then do an act of khidmah that has to do with that act, that imbalance, because it helps purify it from you. So as an example, I'll give you an example. Some people like to spend a lot of money on shoes, right? Like an exorbitant amount of money on shoes. They'll spend like $300 on a pair of shoes. All right, if that's the disease, let's say, if that's the attachment, if that's the fog, then go out of your way to go and buy shoes for poor people, or make sure poor people who can't afford to have shoes either in your area or internationally have access to shoes. And it's, subhanAllah, when you associate it with something that you're actually struggling with, it does become a form of purification. It shows you how petty the attachment is, or the chain is. Number 10 is sidq, is to be honest, and specifically to be honest when we make mistakes with others and when we make mistakes with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the ability to say I'm sorry when you're wrong, and the ability to make tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we have not fulfilled His rights upon us. It comes from a place of honesty. It comes from a place of total surrender and honesty with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that really does clear the fog. A lot of times we are in denial about the different things that we do. As soon as you stand in salah, look into your heart and allow it to be honest with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's something that should motivate you to repent to Allah in the prayer itself, and after the prayer is done, to go back and apologize to those you've harmed. Even people you think you may have harmed but you're not sure about, but maybe you hurt their feelings, even in those cases, if you're afraid, because people are always worried about what will they think, what will they think, what will they think? If you approach someone and your motivator is truly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will bless that interaction. And if you go to someone and you apologize for what you did wrong and they respond with vile behavior, when it's truly for Allah, it doesn't hurt that much. It'll hurt a little bit, but it won't hurt that much, because you didn't necessarily do it for them. You did it because this is what Allah wants from you. You did it to be honest with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 11 is tajdeed, is to never let our spiritual lives become dull and boring. Never get to a place of complacency where you're just like, I'm fine, I have my job, I have my family, I just live, I just enjoy things. You have to have a desire for a renewed sense of purpose. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ once described even our faith as a piece of cloth that needs to be renewed, needs to be washed, needs to be cleansed and made vibrant again. So events like this conference is one of the methods at which we attempt tajdeed with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we are sincere, if we come here and we say, oh Allah, I have come here to benefit from a word that could draw me closer to you, Allah will bring something into your heart that will be a form of tajdeed and renewal for you. A lot of times people want to blame an event for not being affected. Blame the intention in your heart. There's always a way to benefit if you're intending Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whether it's a conference, whether it's a camp or a retreat, whether it's the Friday khutbah, whether it's a halaqah, always look into different ways of drawing closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I believe everyone should always be reading a book of tazkiyah throughout the year, because it's such, even if you're only reading 2 or 3 pages a day, it's such a cleanser. It's something that always brings perspective to whatever problem you're dealing with. Doesn't matter if you're a scholar or a 5-year-old. If there's something that is dealing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and drawing closer to Him, all of us are in need of that reminder, and there are plenty of books that we can recommend. The 12th and final step is to practice overflowing unconditional love for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I would call this hubb fillah. Imagine if you are a sponge that is soaked in water, and if someone were to just poke that sponge, the only thing that's going to come out is water. Imagine that that's how you are, but that's not water inside. That is love and mercy that you want to just spread. You're overflowing with it. You want anyone who comes near you to have an experience of that love and mercy and compassion, because this is an invitation of the love and compassion and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on you. And something that's really beautiful about practicing love for Allah with your brothers and sisters is that you experience the sweetness of faith. It's not just that you're doing something for others, it's that the one who is doing that is the one who is elevated through it, is the one who is in a state of enjoyment, is the one who's in a state of total happiness. It's one of the categories of having the sweetness of Iman. And so these are just 12 things that I wanted to recommend in terms of clearing the fog. There's also something that I wanted to mention that's important in this regard, and I only have a minute to do it. But whatever habit you're working on, try to work on it with your murabbi or with your really good friend that you can trust. Work on it for 40 days. Try to do it for 40 days straight. Every time you slip, go back to day 1. And that sounds really hard, but this is a lifelong path. Self-purification is a lifelong path. And subhanAllah, something that's amazing about a sincere intention is that sometimes as soon as you intend to stop doing it, you literally stop doing it, whatever it is. Sometimes Allah blesses you with that. Other times you may slip and slip and slip, but eventually you stop doing whatever it is. And people are supposed to move from one stage to another very quickly. We move from a stage of disbelief to belief. We move from a stage of the haram into the halal. We move from the stage of what is doubtful to what has no doubt. We move from the stage of being involved in excesses to a stage of moderation. And finally, we move to a stage of having our heart focused only on and attached only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these are the words of Imam Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi. I didn't present the majority of my talk because I always over-prepare. But whatever is beneficial is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever is wrong and mistaken is from myself and the shaitan. And I also wanted to recommend, there's an amazing book that I just read recently, and it's really, really powerful. It's called Agenda to Change Our Condition. And this is by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and Imam Zaid Shakir. Agenda to Change Our Condition. It's a very small book. It's something that I recommend. If you're sitting in a halaqah, study this book together with your halaqah. Go chapter by chapter and study it together for no less than a month. I would say at least 2 months. And then the practices, they have a muraqabah schedule in the back about how to get rid of your bad habits. And again, jazakumullah khair, very honored to spend this time with you. Assalamu alaikum.